Citizens speak out. Many governments across the Arab world have been responding to the legitimate demands of the people for greater rights, respect, democracy and opportunity following protests in their lands.
Among those countries where such demonstrations are occurring are Bahrain, Bolivia, Cote d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast, Croatia, Egypt, Greece, Honduras, India, Libya, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Syria, United Kingdom, and Yemen.
After several groups urged Jordan's King Abdullah II to lead parliamentary change, encouraging him to follow the lead of Morocco's King Mohammed VI, who recently announced a broad-based reform package, King Abdullah II asked Prime Minister Maruf Bakit to enact decisive measures that expose corruption and ensure a more equal justice system. Meanwhile, internet-savvy Tunisian youth who had taken part in the recent peaceful revolution are now supporting national stability by calls through a new Facebook page, I'm Committed to Protecting Tunisia, in which they encourage people to avoid acts of vandalism that contribute to chaos by returning to work and fostering stability. UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon recently traveled to meet with Tunisian youth groups, business and political leaders about their goals for the future.
Following a month of protests in Iraq's autonomous region of Kurdistan, 9 political parties formed the Peace Campaign, a coalition that agrees to refrain from violence of any kind and also to encourage the public toward the same. Protesters' spokesperson Nask Kader announced that the Kurdish parliament has invited members of their interim council to attend a parliament meeting with the goal of reaching an agreement on terms for cooperation and peace.
Addressing the situation in Syria, European Union Foreign Affairs Chief Catherine Ashton asked that the government refrain from violence against protesters who are calling for more freedom and an end to emergency law, while UN Human Rights Chief Navi Pillay has called for an investigation into recent deaths in the country. Meanwhile, Agence France Presse, or AFP, reports that at least 15 more people were killed in Daraa when police stormed a camp they had set up in front of a mosque and dispersed the crowd with gunfire.
In Yemen, President Ali Abdullah Saleh warned of a potential civil war as military forces loyal to the government squared off against those protecting the protesters in the capital of Sana'a, while the Arab League spoke out strongly against the government's use of violence towards citizens. With a newly passed emergency law allowing media censorship as well as banning street protests and suspending the nation's constitution, Abdul Razak al-Hajri of Yemen's Reform Party called it illegal, especially as the law's passage was virtually certain due to the ruling party's illegitimate dominance of parliament. Despite the imposition of martial law, however, protesters said they would continue demanding an immediate end to the current regime, as they called for a large march to the presidential palace on Friday.
Because of the rapidly declining security situation, especially with a protest planned on Friday, the British government announced Wednesday the withdrawal of all except a small core of its embassy staff in Sana'a. The British Foreign Office also issued advice against all travel to the country while strongly urging all Britons in Yemen to leave now.
In Bahrain, the UN Human Rights Office has expressed concern over the arrest and harassment of activists and medical professionals, as well as the disappearance of up to 100 people since the violent repression of protesters last week. UN Human Rights spokesperson Rupert Colville called upon the government of Bahrain to abide by international law and ensure that people are not detained without clear evidence they have committed a recognized crime.
With 500,000 Ivorians who have now fled the catastrophe of war since disputed presidential elections in November 2010, the United Nations has appealed for international help as it warns of a humanitarian crisis developing in both Cote d'Ivoire, or Ivory Coast, and neighboring host country Liberia.
Protests for better living and work conditions in Algeria continue, with dozens of teachers on Wednesday demonstrating across the streets from the presidential palace for the 4th consecutive day, asking for proper job contracts. Also on Wednesday, in a less fortunate neighbourhood of Algiers, police used tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse a crowd of 150, mostly youths, who were trying to halt the government's demolition of homes built without their licence. Following a series of retaliatory actions between Israeli security forces and armed groups in Palestinian Gaza, which harmed innocent civilians, Egypt's Foreign Minister Nabil El-Arabi warns the Israeli government about the adverse effects to regional stability of continuing such attacks, while also urging various groups in Gaza to avoid any actions that might provoke a retaliatory response.
In Libya, following an appeal by Agence France Presse or AFP chairman Emmanuel Houg to Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, AFP reporter Dave Clark and photographer Roberto Schmidt, as well as Getty Images photographer Joe Radel, were released early Wednesday. British Foreign Secretary William Hague commended the early accomplishments of the no-fly zone and efforts to disable Libyan military capabilities in the interest of protecting citizens, stating that these actions increase the chances the Libyan people have for determining their own future.
He also emphasized it is up to the Libyan people to determine the nation's future government and to decide the fate of current leader Muammar Gaddafi. Meanwhile, Russia reiterated calls for the coalition forces to do more in ensuring citizens are not harmed during airstrikes. Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni furthermore called upon the Western governments not to forget about citizens in countries like Yemen and Bahrain, where legitimate protesters are facing live ammunition gunfire.
On Wednesday, 16 more people were killed in Mosurata as government forces used tanks, heavy artillery, and rooftop snipers. Speaking to Reuters news agency by phone, the city's residents described what they called a massacre as they watched snipers fire at even the city hospital, making it impossible for anyone to get in or out, with doctors retreating to building corridors to treat patients. With sorrow for the cherished lives lost, we pray that the conflicts permanently cease and that heaven may grace the people of all nations with lasting security, dignity, freedom, and peace.